Hey everybody, welcome again to TLD. This is another primary source conversations. We're going to go over some audio primary sources and pair them with video and with some visuals and other things. But here I have my two amazing master teachers, Sherrie Galloway and Cindy Stout. Would you like to introduce yourself, Sherrie? You want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm Sherrie Galloway, and I am a retired middle school librarian and spent quite a few years in Washington as a teacher in residence and as a contractor with the Library of Congress. Cindy?
I'm Cindy Stout, and I'm a retired middle school teacher who was lucky enough in 1997 to be selected in the first group of Library of Congress Fellows. And we were charged with using one of their 14 collections at that time to begin to write the collection or a compilation of lessons using primary sources. Today, there are well over 100 collections, so that task would be much more fun.
Great. Well, I thought today I'd focus on the slave narratives, which I'm not sure how many people are familiar with, but these were produced during the WPA, and people from the government went and interviewed people who had been enslaved. Cindy's just shared with us some details about this collection. Cindy, you want to go ahead and share that?
Well, yes. When historians began to write about slavery, the very earliest ones were in like around the 19 teens, were white men from the South. And as they wrote about slaves, they had a definite point of view, shall I say. Later in the 1950s, Kenneth Stamp kind of changed the way people looked at slavery because he used plantation records. But another white man looking at records written by white men. And so Stamp writes about an incident where slaves would put their hands into beehives to get stung so that they wouldn't have to go into the swamps and probably lose their lives. But as Stamp looks at those records, all he sees from the slave owner is like, what's wrong with these guys? You know, who gets stung by bees? Didn't understand that this was a process of survival. So in 1973, a Black historian named John Blasingame really changes, and here's this book, it's called The Slave Community, really changes the way Black history is written. And he used these Federal Writers Project oral histories to look at the Black experience, the slave experience, from an African-American point of view rather than a white point of view. So from there, you have countless historians, white and Black, male and female, who write about the slave experience, which is incredibly different from the early guys who wrote about U.B. Phillips and these early guys that wrote about slavery.
Great. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is the process for them to gather these narratives. And Kyle, you had something to share about that process, and that there were two interviews of the same person, but by two different people.
Yeah, in one of the slave narrative collections, and I forget what the person's name is, and I'm going to find that and I'll link it in this session. But this one lady was visited twice by two different people, and the first time she was visited, she was very leery of the person that came to her door. It was a white man. She thought it was, somebody from the IRS or the government doing, something sketchy. And then the second person that visited her and interviewed her, she was more comfortable with, and she understood that it was, from the Federal Writers Project, and they were there to help tell their story rather than, take their money or whatever. So when you look at those two interviews from the same person, you get such a starkly different, a very contrasting point of view from the same person. So yeah, that's a super interesting one.
And if your students get an opportunity to perhaps help with the Veterans History Project, where they're encouraged to go and interview people, that would be a really good lesson to talk about, how do you ask good questions? How do you make sure that the person you're interviewing is comfortable and can really share what you're hoping to get from them and get a real, not a guarded response, but an authentic one. What I wanted to focus on with this one, oh, go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to plug the Veterans History Project has a brown bag session as well, so be sure to check the recording for that one. That's a really great overview of that whole Veterans History Project.
So this link of this section, which is Voices Remembering Slavery, shows a photograph of the person who was interviewed, and it's an audio recording of the interview. Just hearing someone's voice, and we'll just play maybe a few seconds of this. It's just so powerful. In many cases, the accent or the voice is very difficult to understand, and so if you have a transcript, sometimes that can help too, so that students can read the transcript along as they're listening.
Could you hear that? I didn't get it to play. I don't think.
I'm not hearing it.
I didn't either.
Share computer sound. There we go.
My grandfather was 115 years old when he died, and now I am 101 years old. That's enough. She used to work, but what she made, I don't know. I never asked her.
You just go ahead and talk away there. You don't mind, do you, Uncle Patton?
Now, now your husband and you both are young. You all try to live like young people ought to live. Don't want everything somebody else has got. Whatever you get, it is yours. Be satisfied. And don't spend your money until you get it. So many people get in debt. Well, it was cheap and I bought it. You spend your money before you get it because you're going in debt for what you want. When you want something, wait until you get the money and pay for it cash. That's what I've done.
So he's giving you some advice on how to handle your money. But again, for students to be able to listen and see a picture of what Fountain Hughes looked like, what this person, his life was about, and you can follow that. So figure out, how this might work best. Again, knowing your audience, knowing the age of your students, and how this would be something that you would incorporate into your classroom. I have mentioned in some of my other sessions that I'm always kind of got my ear out for things that I could look up, or things that I could find out more about, or something I've heard on TV. And I happen to be watching a television show that you may be familiar with on PBS that's called Finding Your Roots. And in this session, they were meeting with Pharrell Williams and talking about his life and looking back at his family and his roots. And they said that they had found, a very rare occurrence, especially for African Americans, to find something about their slave relatives, because that documentation is difficult. And they said, and we happened to find a slave narrative by one of your relatives. Well, they printed it out. It was not a slave narrative that had an audio portion. It just was the text. But Jane Arrington, which you can see on this page, was one of Pharrell Williams's aunts. And she tells about her life, and she was 12 years old when they surrendered up here in Raleigh. And then she goes on to tell about the plantation that they lived on and what their life was like. Her siblings, it said, my mother had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. Again, I think I mentioned before that there might be language in here that would be sensitive, that might be difficult. The vocabulary at the time is not vocabulary that we deem acceptable now. So you have to prepare your students for that. But she talks about working on the farm and the cotton stalks and all of that. the most powerful part was how Pharrell Williams reacted to this. He was overcome, and he basically said, stop filming. I just need some time. And his powerful reaction to hearing this information and hearing from a relative long past was really incredibly powerful. They actually had him come back later and then talk about how he felt about that experience and what it meant to him. Really, really incredibly powerful. Now, the PBS recordings of these, you can get snippets of it on YouTube, but you can't get the whole episode unless you're a PBS Passport member. So you might look into that. It might be available now to schools without a membership, but I would suggest, if you get a chance, to listen to this and to see how you think you might be able to work this into a classroom activity. The other thing that I ended up finding was there were several other links that I found that I included in the posting that I did of this story on the TPS network, and found maps of the area where Jane Arrington talks about where they lived and where they walked to school and those kinds of things. So this little talk incorporates video and audio and pictures and maps. And so it's a good example of how one idea, one little thing that connects to you can lead to another, and you can end up building a collection. At this point, I don't have this on the TPS network as an album that can be downloaded, but I will update that and get that to you, Kyle, so that you can include it. Other ideas, Cindy, about using the slave narratives in the classroom?
Well, Sherrie, I think you've really covered the gambit. And the thing I always found when I was teaching, if kids can make a connection, a personal human connection, so much, and Kyle and all you guys out there, excuse me, so much of the history that typically is taught is about dead white men. And most of our students, well, all of our students are not dead, but more and more, fewer and fewer are white. So as you look at your classroom and you see a really fun sort of offshoot of this is to look around and say, go in the Library of Congress and find something about someone that you can relate to. So it may be, if you're Asian Pacific, you might find something there. It just, I think I said before, your creativity is the limit.
So again, if you have questions, if there's ideas that you have that you want to share, to join the TPS network, which is a great way for you to share what you're doing in your classroom, as well as to post questions and ask for help on how best to do this. We can also share, oh, this didn't go very well, and here's what happens. Somebody, can you help me? Give me ideas. The TPS network is a great resource, and it's an opportunity for a dialogue with people who are using primary sources in their classrooms and in their teaching, or for their own personal interest. It's a combination of hopefully you can share these things with your students, but even if it's just something that you want to learn more about, will enlighten your teaching.
So thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of TLD.